Welcome to Fortune Forecast. I am Daisy, your hostess, and you are in my book playlist. We have been going through the book titled The Book of Life by Upton Sinclair, published in 1921 by the Payne Book Company out of Chicago. We are now heading into part 4, which is titled The Book of Society, where the author is attempting to find solutions to a better society in the Book of Life. In the previous chapters, the author was talking about aristocracy and democracy and the idea of superior classes in what is called the basis of the doctrines in governance, in society, in the social group. A very interesting topic to address, just as many of the topics that he includes in this Book of Life. I, speaking for myself, can feel that there is a disparity in our social economic structure. But how do we address it? I suppose as we continue through the pages of this part, we're going to get some perspective from this author's point of view. So if you're ready, let's get started on to the next chapter. The process of social evolution discusses the series of changes through which human society has passed. We have now to consider briefly the history of man as a social being, the groups he has formed, and the changes in his group systems. Everything in life grows, and human societies are no exception to the rule. They have undergone a long process of evolution, which we can trace in detail and which we find conforms exactly to the law laid down by Herbert Spencer. A process whereby a number of single and similar things become different parts of one complex thing. In the case of human societies, the units are men and women, and social evolution is a process whereby a small and simple group in which the individuals are practically alike grows into a larger and complex group, in which the individuals are widely different and their relations one to another are complicated and subtle. There are two powerful forces pressing upon human beings and compelling them to struggle and grow. The first of these forces is fear, the need of protection against enemies. The second is hunger, the need of food and the means of producing and storing food. The first causes the individual to combine with his fellows and establish some form of government, and this is the origin of political evolution. The second causes him to accumulate wealth and to combine industrially, and this is the origin of economic evolution. Because the first force is a little more urgent, we observe in the history of human society that evolution in government precedes evolution in industry. I made this statement some 20 years ago in an article in Collier's Weekly. I wrote to the effect that man's first care was to secure himself against his enemies, and that when he had done this, he set out to secure his food supply. Collier's called upon the late Professor Summer of Yale University, a prize reactionary and Tory of the old school, to answer me. And Professor Summer made merry over my statement, declaring that man sought for food long before he was safe from his enemies. Some years later, when Summer died, one of his admirers wrote in the New York Evening Post that he had completely overwhelmed me, and I had acknowledged my defeat by failing to reply, something which struck me as very funny. It was, of course, possible that Summer had overwhelmed me, but to say that I had considered myself overwhelmed was to attribute to me a degree of modesty of which I was wholly incapable. As a matter of fact, I had had my usual experience with capitalist magazines. Collier's Weekly had promised to publish my rejoinder to Summer, but failed to keep the promise, and finally, when I worried them, they tucked the answer away in the back part of the paper among the advertisements of cigars and toilet soaps. Professor Summer is gone, but he has left behind him an army of pupils, and I will protect myself against them by phrasing my statement with extreme care. I do not mean to say that man first secures himself completely against his enemies and then goes out to hunt for a meal. Of course, he has to eat while he is countering the moves of his enemies. He has to eat while he is on the march to battle or in flight from it. But ask yourself this question. Which would you choose if you had to choose? To go a couple of days without nothing to eat, or to have your throat cut by bandits and your wife and your children carried away into slavery? Certainly, you would do your fighting first, and meantime, you would scratch together any food you could. While you were devoting your energies to putting down civil war, or to making a treaty with other tribes, or to preparing for a military campaign, you would continue to get food in the way your ancestors had got it. In other words, your economic evolution would wait while your political evolution proceeded. But when you had succeeded in putting down your enemies and had a long period of peace before you, then you would plant some fields and domesticate some animals, or perhaps discover some new way of weaving cloth, and so your industrial life would make progress. It is easy to see why Professor Summer wished to confuse this issue. He could not deny political evolution because it had happened. He despised and feared political democracy, but it was here, and he had to speak politely to it, as to a tiger that had got into his house. But industrial democracy was a thing that had not yet happened in the world. It was only a hope and a prophecy, and therefore a prize old Tory was free to ridicule it. I remember reading somewhere his statement. The notion that democracy had anything to do with industry, or could in any way be applied to industry, was a piece of silliness. So, of course, he sought to demolish my idea that there was a process of evolution in economic affairs, paralleling the process of political evolution, which had already culminated in democracy. Let us consider the process of political evolution briefly and in its broad outlines. Take any savage tribe. You find it composed of individuals who are very much alike. Some are a little stronger than others, a little more clever, more powerful in battle. But the difference is slight, and when the tribe chooses someone to lead them, they might as well choose one man as another. They all have a say in the tribe councils, both men and women. Their rights in the tribe are the same. They are, of course, slaves to ignorance, to degrading superstition and absurd taboos. But these things apply to everyone alike. There is no privileged caste, no hereditary inequality. But little by little, as the tribe grows in numbers and in power and intelligence, as it comes to capture slaves in battle and to unite with other tribes, there comes to be a hereditary chieftain and a group of his leading supporters, his courtiers and henchmen. When the society has evolved into the stage which we call barbarism, there is a permanent superior caste. There are hereditary priests who have in their keeping the favor of the gods, and there is a subject population of slaves. The society moves on into the feudal stage, in which the various grades and classes are precisely marked off, each with its different functions, its different privileges and rights and duties. The feudal principalities and duties war and struggle among themselves. They are united by marriage or by conquest, and presently some stronger ruler brings a great territory under his power. We have what is called a kingdom, a society still larger, still more complex in its organization, and still more rigid in its class distinctions. Take France. Under the ancient regime, and compare a courtier of noble gentlemen with a serf. They are not only different before the law, they are different in the language they use, in the clothes they wear, in the ideas they hold. They are different even in their bodies, so that the gentleman regards the serf as an inferior species of creature. The kings warred among themselves, and emperors arose. The ultimate ideal in Europe was a political society which should include the whole continent, and this ideal was several times almost attained. But it is the rule of history that wherever a large society is built upon the basis of privilege and enslavement, the ruling class prove morally and intellectually unequal to the burden put upon them. They become corrupted, and their rule becomes intolerable. This happened in Europe, and there came political revolutions, first in England, which accomplished it by gradual stages, and then in the French monarchy, and quite recently in a dozen monarchies and empires, large and small. What precisely is this political revolution? Let us consider the case of France, where the change was sudden and the issues precisely drawn. King Louis XIV had said, "I am the state." To a person of our time, that might seem like boasting, but it was merely an assertion of the existing political fact. King Louis was the state by universal consent and by divine authority, as all men believed. The army was his army, the navy was his navy, and wars, when he made them, were his wars. Everyone in the state was his subject, and all the property of the state was his personal, private property to dispose of as he pleased. The government officials carried out his will, and members of the nobility held the land and ruled in his name. But now suddenly, the people of France overthrew the king and put him to death and drove the nobles into exile. They seized the power of the French state and proclaimed themselves equal citizens in the state, with equal voices in its government and equal rights before the law. So we call France a republic and describe this form of society as political democracy. It is the completion of the process of political evolution, and you will see that it moves in a sort of spiral, having completed a circle and got back where it was before, but upon a higher plane. The citizens of a modern republic are equal before the law, just as were the members of the savage tribe. But the political organization is vastly larger and infinitely more complicated, and every individual lives his life upon a higher level because he shares in the benefits of this more highly organized and more powerful state. End of chapter 52. All right, before I move on to the next chapter right here on this video, take a minute, hit that like button, grab your coffee, grab your tea, and whatever time of day, grab your wine, as I now move on to chapter 53, Industrial Evolution. Examines the process of evolution in industry and the stage which it has so far reached. And now let us consider the process of industrial evolution. We shall find it to be exactly the same thing, reproducing the changes in another field of activity. You may picture two gigantic waves sweeping over the ocean. In some places, the waves are far apart, and in other places, they are closer together. For a time, they may mingle, and perhaps their bases always mingle. It would be easy for a critic to point out how political affairs play a leading part in industrial evolution, and vice versa. It would be easy to argue that property rules the political state, or again, that the main function of the political state is to protect property. As I have said, man has to fight his enemies, and he has to seek food, and often he has to do the two things at the same time. But nevertheless, broadly speaking, we observe two great waves sweeping over human society, and most of the time these waves are clearly separated and easily distinguished. Industry in a savage tribe is like government, simple and uniform. All the members of the tribe get their living in the same way. One may be a little more expert as a fisherman, another as a gatherer of coconuts. The fisherman gathers coconuts and the coconut gatherer fishes. In the days of the primitive communism, there is little economic strife and little change. But as slavery comes in and the private property system, there begins industrial war. The members of the tribe trade with one another and argue over prices, and gradually some get the better of others. They accumulate slaves and goods, and later on they appropriate the land to their private use. Of course, the men who do this are often the rulers of the tribe, and so politics and industry are mixed. But even assuming that the state never interfered, assuming that the government allowed business affairs to work themselves out in their own way, the tendency of competition is always to end in monopoly. The big fish eat the little fish, the strong gain advantage over the weak, the rich grow richer, and the poor grow relatively poorer. As the amount of trading increases and men specialize in the arts of bargaining, we see again and again how money concentrates in the hands of a few. It does this even when the political state tries to prevent it, as for example, when the princes and dukes of the Middle Ages would torture the Jewish moneylenders and take away their treasure, but the Jews never failed to grow rich again. It is when political evolution has completed itself and a republic has been set up that a free field is given to economic forces to work themselves out to their logical end. We have seen this in the United States, where we all started pretty much on the same economic level and where political tyranny has had little hold. Our civilization is a civilization of the trader, the businessman, as we call him. And we see how big business absorbs little business and grows constantly larger and more powerful. We are familiar with what we call graft, the use by businessmen of the powers of government to get trade advantage for themselves, and we have a school of old-time thinkers calling themselves Jeffersonian Democrats who insist that if only there had never been any government favors, economic equality and democracy would have endured forever in our country. But it is my opinion that government has done far more to prevent monopoly and special privilege in business than to favor it. And nevertheless, monopoly has grown. In other words, the tendency toward concentration in business, the absorption of a small business by the big business, is an irresistible natural process which neither can be nor should be hindered. The condition of competition, whether in politics or in industry, is never a permanent one and can never be made permanent. It is a struggle which automatically brings itself to an end. Large-scale production and distribution is more economical than small-scale, and big business has irresistible advantages of credit and permanence over little business. As we shall presently show, the blind and indiscriminate production of goods under the competitive system leads to the glutting of markets and to industrial crisis. At such times, the weaker concerns are weeded out and the strong ones take their trade. And as a result, we have the modern great corporation, the most powerful machine of production yet devised by man, and which corresponds in every aspect to the monarchy in political society. We are accustomed to speak of our captains of industry, our coal kings and our beef barons and lords of steel, and we think we are using metaphors. But the universality of these metaphors points to a fundamental truth in them. As a matter of fact, our modern captain of industry fills in the economic world exactly the same functions as were filled in ancient days by the head of a feudal state. He has won his power in a similar struggle, and he holds it by similar methods. He rules over an organization of human beings, arranged, economically speaking, in grades and classes, with their authorities and privileges and duties precisely determined as under the ancient regime. And just as King Louis said, "I am the state," so Mr. Armour considers that he is Armour and Company, and Mr. Morgan considers that he is the House of Morgan, and that the business exists for him and is controlled by him under divine authority. If I am correct in my analysis of the situation, this process of industrial evolution is destined to complete itself, as in the case of the political state. The subject populations of industry are becoming more and more discontented with their servitude, more and more resentful of that authority which compels them to labor while others reap the benefit. They are organizing themselves and preparing for a social transformation which will parallel in every detail the revolution by which our ancestors overthrew the authority of King George III over the American colonies and made inhabitants of those colonies no longer subjects of a king, but free and equal citizens of a republic. I expect to see a change throughout the world, which will take the great instruments of production, which we call corporation and trust, out of the hands of their present private owners and make them the property, either of the entire community or of those who do the work in them. This change is the social revolution, and when it has completed itself, we shall have in that society an industrial republic, a form of business management which constitutes economic democracy. The history of the world's political revolutions has been written almost exclusively by aristocratic or bourgeois historians. That is to say, by men who, whatever their attitude toward political democracy, have no conception of industrial democracy and believe that industrial strife and enslavement are the normal conditions of life. If, however, you will read Kropotkin's Great French Revolution, you will be interested to discover how important a part was played in this revolution by economic forces. Underneath the political discontent of the merchants and middle classes lay a vast mass of social discontent of the peasants and workers. It was the masses of the people who made the revolution, but it was the middle classes who seized it and turned it to their own ends, putting down attempts toward economic equality and confining the changes so far as possible to the political field. And everywhere throughout history, if you study revolutions, you will find that same thing happening. You find, for example, Martin Luther fighting for the right to preach the word of God without consulting the Pope. But when the peasants of Germany rose and sought to set themselves free from feudal landlords, Luther turned against them and called upon the princes to shoot them down. Quote, "The ass needs to be beaten and the populace needs to be controlled with a strong hand." End quote. The landlords and propertied classes of England were willing to restrict the power of the king and to give the vote to the educated and well-to-do. But from the time of Jack Cade to our own, they shoot down the poor. But meantime, the industrial process continues. The modern factory system brings the workers together in larger and larger groups and teaches them the lessons of class consciousness. So the time of the workers draws near. The first attempt in modern times to accomplish the social revolution and set up industrial democracy was in the Paris Commune. When the French Empire collapsed, after the war with Germany in 1871, the workers of Paris seized control. They were massacred, some 50,000 of them, and the propertied classes of France established the present bourgeois republic, which has now become the bulwark of reaction throughout the continent of Europe. Next came the Russian Revolution of 1905, and this was an interesting illustration of the relation between the two waves of social progress. Russia was a backward country industrially, and according to theory, not all prepared for the social revolution. But nowadays, the thoughts of men circulate all over the world, and exiles from Russia had absorbed Marxian ideas and were not prepared to accept a purely political freedom. So, in 1905, after the Japanese War, when the people rose and forced the Tsar to grant a parliament, the extremists made an effort to accomplish the social revolution at the time. The peasants began to demand the land and the workers the factories, whereupon the capitalists and the middle classes who wanted a parliament but did not want socialism went over to the side of reaction, and both the political and social revolutions were crushed. But then came the Great War, for which Russia, with her incompetent government and her underdeveloped industry, was unprepared. The strain of it broke her down long before the other allies, and in the universal suffering and ruin, the Russian people were again forced to rise. The political revolution was accomplished. The Tsar was imprisoned, and Duma resigned supreme. Middle-class liberalism throughout the world gave its blessing to this revolution and hastened to welcome a new political democracy to the Society of Nations. But then occurred what to orthodox democratic opinion has been the most terrifying spectacle in human history. The Russian people had been driven too far towards starvation and despair. The masses had been too embittered, and they rose again, overthrowing not only their czar and their grand dukes, but their capitalists and landowners. For the first time in history, the social revolution established itself, and the workers were in control of a great state. Ever since then, we have seen exactly what we saw in Europe from 1789 onward, when the first political republic was established and all the monarchies and empires of the world banded themselves together to stamp it out. We have witnessed a campaign of war, blockage, intrigue, and propaganda against the Soviet government of Russia, all pretending to be carried on in the name of the Russian people and for the purpose of saving them from suffering, but all obviously based upon one consideration and one alone: the fear that an effort at industrial self-government might possibly prove to be a success. Whether or not the Soviets will prove permanent, no one can say. But this much is certain. Just as the French Revolution sent a thrill around the world and planted in the hearts of the common people the wonderful dream of freedom from kings and ruling classes, just so the Russian Revolution has brought to the working masses the dream of freedom from masters and landlords. Everywhere in capitalist society, this ferment is growing, and in one country after another, we see the first pangs of the new birth. Also, we see capitalists and landlords who once found democracy, free speech, and equality before the law useful formulas to break down the power of kings and aristocrats, now repudiating their old-time beliefs and going back to the frankest reaction. We see, in our own land of the free, the government refusing to reprint the Declaration of Independence during the war and arresting men for quoting from it and circulating it. We even see the Department of Justice refusing to allow people to reprint the Sermon on the Mount. End of chapter 53. I will meet you now at the next video for chapter 54. The class struggle. Hit that like button, and if you haven't done so, you like what you see here, subscribe to the channel.